A fathom deep in sleep I lie with old desires, restrained before, to clamor lifeward with a cry, as dark flies out the graying door, and so in quest of creeds to share I seek assertive day again. But old monotony is there, endless avenues of rain. Oh, might I rise again? Might I throw off the heat of that old wine, see the new morning mask the sky with fairy towers, line on line, find each mirage in the high air a symbol, not a dream again? But old monotony is there, endless avenues of rain. Under the glass portcullis of a theatre Amory stood, watching the first great drops of rain splatter down and flatten to dark stains on the sidewalk. The air became gray and opalescent, a solitary light suddenly outlined a window over the way, then another light, then 100 more danced and glimmered into vision. Under his feet a thick, iron-studded skylight turned yellow. In the street the lamps of the taxicabs sent out glistening sheens along the already black pavement. The unwelcome November rain had perversely stolen the day's last hour and pawned it with that ancient fence, the night. The silence of the theater behind him ended with a curious snapping sound, followed by the heavy roaring of a rising crowd and the interlaced clatter of many voices. The matinee was over. He stood aside, edged a little into the rain to let the throng pass. A small boy rushed out, sniffed in the damp, fresh air and turned up the collar of his coat. Came 3 or 4 couples in a great hurry. Came a further scattering of people whose eyes as they emerged glanced invariably, first at the wet street, then at the rain-filled air, finally at the dismal sky, last a dense, strolling mass that depressed him with its heavy odor compounded of the tobacco smell of the men and the fetid sensuousness of stale powder on women. After the thick crowd came another scattering, a stray half-dozen, a man on crutches. Finally the rattling bang of folding seats inside announced that the ushers were at work. New York seemed not so much awakening as turning over in its bed. Pallid men rushed by, pinching together their coat collars. A great swarm of tired, magpie girls from a department store crowded along with shrieks of strident laughter, 3 to an umbrella. A squad of marching policemen passed, already miraculously protected by oilskin capes. The rain gave Amory a feeling of detachment, and the numerous unpleasant aspects of city life without money occurred to him in threatening procession. There was the ghastly, stinking crush of the subway, the car cards thrusting themselves at one, leering out like dull bores who grab your arm with another story, the querulous worry as to whether someone isn't leaning on you, a man deciding not to give his seat to a woman, hating her for it, the woman hating him for not doing it, at worst a squalid phantasmagoria of breath. An old cloth on human bodies and the smells of the food men ate, at best just people, too hot or too cold, tired, worried. He pictured the rooms where these people lived, where the patterns of the blistered wallpapers were heavy reiterated sunflowers on green and yellow backgrounds, where there were tin bathtubs and gloomy hallways and verdureless, unnameable spaces in back of the buildings, where even love dressed as seduction, assorted murder around the corner, illicit motherhood in the flat above. And always there was the economical stuffiness of indoor winter, and the long summers, nightmares of perspiration between sticky enveloping walls, dirty restaurants where careless, tired people helped themselves to sugar with their own used coffee spoons, leaving hard brown deposits in the bowl. It was not so bad where there were only men or else only women, it was when they were vilely herded that it all seemed so rotten. It was some shame that women gave off at having men see them tired and poor. It was some disgust that men had for women who were tired and poor. It was dirtier than any battlefield he had seen, harder to contemplate than any actual hardship molded of mire and sweat and danger. It was an atmosphere wherein birth and marriage and death were loathsome, secret things. He remembered one day in the subway when a delivery boy had brought in a great funeral wreath of fresh flowers, how the smell of it had suddenly cleared the air and given everyone in the car a momentary glow. I detest poor people, thought Amory suddenly. I hate them for being poor. Poverty may have been beautiful once, but it's rotten now. It's the ugliest thing in the world. It's essentially cleaner to be corrupt and rich than it is to be innocent and poor. He seemed to see again a figure whose significance had once impressed him, a well-dressed young man gazing from a club window on Fifth Avenue and saying something to his companion with a look of utter disgust. Probably, thought Amory, what he said was, "My God." Aren't people horrible? Never before in his life had Amory considered poor people. He thought cynically how completely he was lacking in all human sympathy. Oh, Henry had found in these people romance, pathos, love, hate. Amory saw only coarseness, physical filth, and stupidity. He made no self-accusations, never any more did he reproach himself for feelings that were natural and sincere. He accepted all his reactions as a part of him, unchangeable, unmoral. This problem of poverty transformed, magnified, attached to some grander, more dignified attitude might someday even be his problem. At present it roused only his profound distaste. He walked over to Fifth Avenue, dodging the blind, black menace of umbrellas, and standing in front of Delmonico's hailed an autobus. Buttoning his coat closely around him, he climbed to the roof, where he rode in solitary state through the thin, persistent rain, stung into alertness by the cool moisture perpetually reborn on his cheek. Somewhere in his mind a conversation began, rather resumed its place in his attention. It was composed not of two voices, but of one, which acted alike as questioner and answerer. Question. Well, what's the situation? Answer. That I have about $24 to my name. Q. You have the Lake Geneva estate. A. But I intend to keep it. Q. Can you live? I can't imagine not being able to. People make money in books, and I've found that I can always do the things that people do in books. Really, they are the only things I can do. Q. Be definite. I don't know what I'll do, nor have I much curiosity. Tomorrow I'm going to leave New York for good. It's a bad town unless you're on top of it. Q. Do you want a lot of money? A. No. I am merely afraid of being poor. Q. Very afraid? A. Just passively afraid. Q. Where are you drifting? A. Don't ask me. Q. Don't you care? A. Rather. I don't want to commit moral suicide. Q. Have you no interests left? A. None. I've no more virtue to lose. Just as a cooling pot gives off heat, so all through youth and adolescence we give off calories of virtue. That's what's called ingenuousness. Q. An interesting idea. That's why a good man going wrong attracts people. They stand around and literally warm themselves at the calories of virtue he gives off. Sarah makes an unsophisticated remark and the faces simper in delight. How innocent the poor child is. They're warming themselves at her virtue. But Sarah sees the simper and never makes that remark again. Only she feels a little colder after that. Q. All your calories gone? A. All of them. I'm beginning to warm myself at other people's virtue. Q. Are you corrupt? A. I think so. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about good and evil at all anymore. Q. Is that a bad sign in itself? A. Not necessarily. Q. What would be the test of corruption? Becoming really insincere, calling myself not such a bad fellow, thinking I regretted my lost youth when I only envy the delights of losing it. Youth is like having a big plate of candy. Sentimentalists think they want to be in the pure, simple state they were in before they ate the candy. They don't. They just want the fun of eating it all over again. The matron doesn't want to repeat her girlhood, she wants to repeat her honeymoon. I don't want to repeat my innocence. I want the pleasure of losing it again. Q. Where are you drifting? This dialogue merged grotesquely into his mind's most familiar state, a grotesque blending of desires, worries, exterior impressions, and physical reactions. 127th Street or 137th Street. 2 and 3 look alike. No, not much. Seat damp. Are clothes absorbing wetness from seat, or seat absorbing dryness from clothes? Sitting on wet substance gave appendicitis, so Froggy Parker's mother said. Well, he'd had it. I'll sue the steamboat company, Beatrice said, and my uncle has a quarter interest. Did Beatrice go to heaven? Probably not. He represented Beatrice's immortality, also love affairs of numerous dead men who surely had never thought of him. If it wasn't appendicitis, influenza maybe. What? 120th Street? That must have been 112th back there. 102 instead of 127. Rosalind's not like Beatrice, Eleanor like Beatrice, only wilder and brainier. Apartments along here expensive, probably $150 a month, maybe $200. Uncle had only paid $100 a month for whole great big house in Minneapolis. Question, were the stairs on the left or right as you came in? Anyway, in 12 Univ they were straight back and to the left. What a dirty river, want to go down there and see if it's dirty. French rivers all brown or black, so were southern rivers. $24 meant 480 donuts. He could live on it 3 months and sleep in the park. Wonder where Jill was. Jill Bain, Fane, saying, what the devil, neck hurts, darned uncomfortable seat. No desire to sleep with Jill. What could Alec see in her? Alec had a coarse taste in women. Own taste the best. Isabel, Clara, Rosalind, Eleanor were all American. Eleanor would pitch, probably southpaw. Rosalind was outfield, wonderful hitter. Clara first base, maybe. Wonder what Humbard's body looked like now. If he himself hadn't been bayonet instructor, he'd have gone up to line 3 months sooner, probably been killed. Where's the darned bell? The street numbers of Riverside Drive were obscured by the mist and dripping trees from anything but the swiftest scrutiny, but Amory had finally caught sight of 127th Street. He got off and with no distinct destination followed a winding, descending sidewalk and came out facing the river, in particular a long pier and a partition litter of shipyards for miniature craft, small launches, canoes, rowboats, and catboats. He turned northward and followed the shore, jumped a small wire fence and found himself in a great disorderly yard adjoining a dock. The hulls of many boats in various stages of repair were around him. He smelled sawdust and paint and the scarcely distinguishable fiat odor of the Hudson. A man approached through the heavy gloom. "Hello," said Amory. "Got a pass?" "No." "Is this private?" "This is the Hudson River Sporting and Yacht Club." "Oh. I didn't know. I'm just resting." "Well," began the man dubiously. "I'll go if you want me to." The man made noncommittal noises in his throat and passed on. Amory seated himself on an overturned boat and leaned forward thoughtfully until his chin rested in his hand. "Misfortune is liable to make me a damn bad man," he said slowly. In the drooping hours. While the rain drizzled on, Amory looked futilely back at the stream of his life, all its glitterings and dirty shallows. To begin with, he was still afraid, not physically afraid anymore, but afraid of people and prejudice and misery and monotony. Yet, deep in his bitter heart, he wondered if he was after all worse than this man or the next. He knew that he could sophisticate himself finally into saying that his own weakness was just the result of circumstances and environment, that often when he raged at himself as an egotist something would whisper ingratiatingly, "No. Genius." That was one manifestation of fear, that voice which whispered that he could not be both great and good, that genius was the exact combination of those inexplicable grooves and twists in his mind, that any discipline would curb it to mediocrity. Probably more than any concrete vice or failing, Amory despised his own personality. He loathed knowing that tomorrow and the 1,000 days after he would swell pompously at a compliment and sulk at an ill word like a third-rate musician or a first-class actor. He was ashamed of the fact that very simple and honest people usually distrusted him, that he had been cruel, often, to those who had sunk their personalities in him, several girls, and a man here and there through college, that he had been an evil influence on people who had followed him here and there into mental adventures from which he alone rebounded unscathed. Usually, on nights like this, for there had been many lately, he could escape from this consuming introspection by thinking of children and the infinite possibilities of children. He leaned and listened, and he heard a startled baby awake in a house across the street and lend a tiny whimper to the still night. Quick as a flash he turned away, wondering with a touch of panic whether something in the brooding despair of his mood had made a darkness in its tiny soul. He shivered. What if someday the balance was overturned, and he became a thing that frightened children and crept into rooms in the dark, approached dim communion with those phantoms who whispered shadowy secrets to the mad of that dark continent upon the moon? Amory smiled a bit. "You're too much wrapped up in yourself," he heard someone say. And again. "Get out and do some real work. Stop worrying." He fancied a possible future comment of his own. "Yes, I was perhaps an egotist in youth, but I soon found it made me morbid to think too much about myself." Suddenly he felt an overwhelming desire to let himself go to the devil, not to go violently as a gentleman should, but to sink safely and sensuously out of sight. He pictured himself in an adobe house in Mexico, half reclining on a rug-covered couch, his slender, artistic fingers closed on a cigarette while he listened to guitars strumming melancholy undertones to an age-old dirge of Castile, and an olive-skinned, carmine-lipped girl caressed his hair. Here he might live a strange litany, delivered from right and wrong and from the hound of heaven and from every god, except the exotic Mexican one who was pretty slack himself and rather addicted to Oriental scents, delivered from success and hope and poverty into that long chute of indulgence which led, after all, only to the artificial lake of death. There were so many places where one might deteriorate pleasantly, Port said: Shanghai, parts of Turkestan, Constantinople, the South Seas, all lands of sad, haunting music and many odors, where lust could be a mode and expression of life, where the shades of night skies and sunsets would seem to reflect only moods of passion, the colors of lips and poppies. Still weeding. Once he had been miraculously able to scent evil as a horse detects a broken bridge at night, but the man with the queer feet in Phoebe's room had diminished to the aura over Jill. His instinct perceived the fetidness of poverty, but no longer ferreted out the deeper evils in pride and sensuality. There were no more wise men, there were no more heroes. Burne Holiday was sunk from sight as though he had never lived. Monsignor was dead. Amory had grown up to 1,000 books, 1,000 lies. He had listened eagerly to people who pretended to know, who knew nothing. The mystical reveries of saints that had once filled him with awe in the still hours of night, now vaguely repelled him. The Byrons and Brooks who had defied life from mountain tops were in the end but flaneurs and poseurs, at best mistaking the shadow of courage for the substance of wisdom. The pageantry of his disillusion took shape in a world-old procession of prophets, Athenians, martyrs, saints, scientists, Don Juans, Jesuits, Puritans, Fausts, poets, pacifists. Like costumed alumni at a college reunion, they streamed before him as their dreams, personalities, and creeds had in turn thrown colored lights on his soul. Each had tried to express the glory of life and the tremendous significance of man. Each had boasted of synchronizing what had gone before into his own rickety generalities. Each had depended after all on the set stage and the convention of the theater, which is that man in his hunger for faith will feed his mind with the nearest and most convenient food. Women, of whom he had expected so much, whose beauty he had hoped to transmute into modes of art, whose unfathomable instincts, marvelously incoherent and inarticulate, he had thought to perpetuate in terms of experience, had become merely consecrations to their own posterity. Isabel, Clara, Rosalind, Eleanor, were all removed by their very beauty, around which men had swarmed, from the possibility of contributing anything but a sick heart and a page of puzzled words to write. Amory based his loss of faith in help from others on several sweeping syllogisms. Granted that his generation, however bruised and decimated from this Victorian war, were the heirs of progress. Waving aside petty differences of conclusions which, although they might occasionally cause the deaths of several millions of young men, might be explained away, supposing that after all Bernard Shaw and Bernhardi, Bonner Law and Bethmann Hollweg were mutual heirs of progress, if only in agreeing against the ducking of witches, waiving the antitheses and approaching individually these men who seemed to be the leaders, he was repelled by the discrepancies and contradictions in the men themselves. There was, for example, Thornton Hancock, respected by half the intellectual world as an authority on life, a man who had verified and believed the code he lived by, an educator of educators, an advisor to presidents, yet Amory knew that this man had, in his heart, leaned on the priest of another religion. And Monsignor, upon whom a cardinal rested, had moments of strange and horrible insecurity, inexplicable in a religion that explained even disbelief in terms of its own faith. If you doubted the devil, it was the devil that made you doubt him. Amory had seen Monsignor go to the houses of stolid Philistines, read popular novels furiously, saturate himself in routine, to escape from that horror. And this priest, a little wiser, somewhat purer, had been, Amory knew, not essentially older than he. Amory was alone. He had escaped from a small enclosure into a great labyrinth. He was where Goethe was when he began Faust. He was where Conrad was when he wrote Almayer's Folly. Amory said to himself that there were essentially two sorts of people who through natural clarity or disillusion left the enclosure and sought the labyrinth. There were men like Wells and Plato, who had, half unconsciously, a strange, hidden orthodoxy, who would accept for themselves only what could be accepted for all men, incurable romanticists who never, for all their efforts, could enter the labyrinth as stark souls. There were on the other hand sword-like pioneering personalities, Samuel Butler, Renan, Voltaire, who progressed much slower, yet eventually much further, not in the direct pessimistic line of speculative philosophy but concerned in the eternal attempt to attach a positive value to life. Amory stopped. He began for the first time in his life to have a strong distrust of all generalities and epigrams. They were too easy, too dangerous to the public mind. Yet all thought usually reached the public after 30 years in some such form. Benson and Chesterton had popularized Huysmans and Newman, Shaw had sugar-coated Nietzsche and Ibsen and Schopenhauer. The man in the street heard the conclusions of dead genius through someone else's clever paradoxes and didactic epigrams. Life was a damned muddle, a football game with everyone offside and the referee gotten rid of, everyone claiming the referee would have been on his side. Progress was a labyrinth, people plunging blindly in and then rushing wildly back, shouting that they had found it, the invisible king, the elan vital, the principle of evolution, writing a book, starting a war, founding a school. Amory, even had he not been a selfish man, would have started all inquiries with himself. He was his own best example, sitting in the rain, a human creature of sex and pride, foiled by chance and his own temperament of the bomb of love and children, preserved to help in building up the living consciousness of the race. In self-reproach and loneliness and disillusion he came to the entrance of the labyrinth. Another dawn flung itself across the river, a belated taxi hurried along the street, its lamps still shining like burning eyes in a face white from a night's carouse. A melancholy siren sounded far down the river. Monsignor. Amory kept thinking how Monsignor would have enjoyed his own funeral. It was magnificently Catholic and liturgical. Bishop O'Neill sang solemn high mass and the cardinal gave the final absolutions. Thornton Hancock, Mrs. Lawrence, the British and Italian ambassadors, the papal delegate, and a host of friends and priests were there, yet the inexorable shears had cut through all these threads that Monsignor had gathered into his hands. To Amory it was a haunting grief to see him lying in his coffin, with closed hands upon his purple vestments. His face had not changed, and, as he never knew he was dying, it showed no pain or fear. It was Amory's dear old friend, his and the others', for the church was full of people with daft, staring faces, the most exalted seeming the most stricken. The cardinal, like an archangel in cope and mitre, sprinkled the holy water, the organ broke into sound, the choir began to sing the Requiem Aeternam. All these people grieved because they had to some extent depended upon Monsignor. Their grief was more than sentiment for the crack in his voice or a certain break in his walk, as Wells put it. These people had leaned on Monsignor's faith, his way of finding cheer, of making religion a thing of lights and shadows, making all light and shadow merely aspects of God. People felt safe when he was near. Of Amory's attempted sacrifice had been born merely the full realization of his disillusion, but of Monsignor's funeral was born the romantic elf who was to enter the labyrinth with him. He found something that he wanted, had always wanted and always would want, not to be admired, as he had feared, not to be loved, as he had made himself believe, but to be necessary to people, to be indispensable. He remembered the sense of security he had found in Bern. Life opened up in one of its amazing bursts of radiance, and Amory suddenly and permanently rejected an old epigram that had been playing listlessly in his mind: very few things matter and nothing matters very much. On the contrary, Amory felt an immense desire to give people a sense of security. The Big Man with Goggles. On the day that Amory started on his walk to Princeton, the sky was a colorless vault, cool, high and barren of the threat of rain. It was a gray day, that least fleshly of all weathers, a day of dreams and far hopes and clear visions. It was a day easily associated with those abstract truths and purities that dissolve in the sunshine or fade out in mocking laughter by the light of the moon. The trees and clouds were carved in classical severity, the sounds of the countryside had harmonized to a monotone, metallic as a trumpet, breathless as the Grecian urn. The day had put Amory in such a contemplative mood that he caused much annoyance to several motorists who were forced to slow up considerably or else run him down. So engrossed in his thoughts was he that he was scarcely surprised at that strange phenomenon, cordiality manifested within 50 miles of Manhattan, when a passing car slowed down beside him and a voice hailed him. He looked up and saw a magnificent locomobile in which sat two middle-aged men, one of them small and anxious-looking, apparently an artificial growth, on the other who was large and begoggled and imposing. "Do you want a lift?" asked the apparently artificial growth, glancing from the corner of his eye at the imposing man as if for some habitual, silent corroboration. "You bet I do. Thanks." The chauffeur swung open the door, and, climbing in, Amory settled himself in the middle of the back seat. He took in his companions curiously. The chief characteristic of the big man seemed to be a great confidence in himself set off against a tremendous boredom with everything around him. That part of his face which protruded under the goggles was what is generally termed strong. Rolls of not undignified fat had collected near his chin. Somewhere above was a wide thin mouth and the rough model for a Roman nose, and, below, his shoulders collapsed without a struggle into the powerful bulk of his chest and belly. He was excellently and quietly dressed. Amory noticed that he was inclined to stare straight at the back of the chauffeur's head as if speculating steadily but hopelessly some baffling hirsute problem. The smaller man was remarkable only for his complete submersion in the personality of the other. He was of that lower secretarial type who at 40 have engraved upon their business cards, "Assistant to the President," and without a sigh consecrate the rest of their lives to second-hand mannerisms. "Going far?" asked the smaller man in a pleasant, disinterested way. "Quite a stretch." "Hiking for exercise?" "No," responded Amory succinctly, "I'm walking because I can't afford to ride." "Oh. Then again. Are you looking for work?" "Because there's lots of work," he continued rather testily. "All this talk of lack of work. The West is especially short of labor. He expressed the west with a sweeping, lateral gesture. Amory nodded politely. Have you a trade? No, Amory had no trade. Clerk, eh? No, Amory was not a clerk. Whatever your line is, said the little man, seeming to agree wisely with something Amory had said, now is the time of opportunity and business openings. He glanced again toward the big man, as a lawyer grilling a witness glances involuntarily at the jury. Amory decided that he must say something and for the life of him could think of only one thing to say. Of course I want a great lot of money. The little man laughed mirthlessly but conscientiously. That's what everyone wants nowadays, but they don't want to work for it. A very natural, healthy desire. Almost all normal people want to be rich without great effort except the financiers and problem plays, who want to crash their way through. Don't you want easy money? Of course not, said the secretary indignantly. But, continued Amory disregarding him, being very poor at present I am contemplating socialism as possibly my forte. Both men glanced at him curiously. These bomb throwers, the little man ceased as words lurched ponderously from the big man's chest. If I thought you were a bomb thrower I'd run you over to the Newark jail. That's what I think of socialists. Amory laughed. What are you? Asked the big man, one of these parlor Bolsheviks, one of these idealists? I must say I fail to see the difference. The idealists loaf around and write the stuff that stirs up the poor immigrants. Well, said Amory, if being an idealist is both safe and lucrative, I might try it. What's your difficulty? Lost your job? Not exactly, but, well, call it that. What was it? Writing copy for an advertising agency. Lots of money in advertising. Amory smiled discreetly. Oh, I'll admit there's money in it eventually. Talent doesn't starve anymore. Even art gets enough to eat these days. Artists draw your magazine covers, write your advertisements, hash out ragtime for your theaters. By the great commercializing of printing you found a harmless, polite occupation for every genius who might have carved his own niche. But beware the artist who's an intellectual also. The artist who doesn't fit the Rousseau, the Tolstoy, the Samuel Butler, the Amory Blaine. Who's he? Demanded the little man suspiciously. Well, said Amory, he's an intellectual personage not very well known at present. The little man laughed his conscientious laugh, and stopped rather suddenly as Amory's burning eyes turned on him. What are you laughing at? These intellectual people. Do you know what it means? The little man's eyes twitched nervously. Why, it usually means. It always means brainy and well-educated, interrupted Amory. It means having an active knowledge of the race's experience. Amory decided to be very rude. He turned to the big man. The young man, he indicated the secretary with his thumb, and said young man as one says bellboy, with no implication of youth, has the usual muddled connotation of all popular words. You object to the fact that capital controls printing, said the big man, fixing him with his goggles. Yes, and I object to doing their mental work for them. It seemed to me that the root of all the business I saw around me consisted in overworking and underpaying a bunch of dubs who submitted to it. "Here now," said the big man, "you'll have to admit that the laboring man is certainly highly paid 5 and 6 hour days. It's ridiculous. You can't buy an honest day's work from a man in the trades unions." "You've brought it on yourselves," insisted Amory. "You people never make concessions until they're wrung out of you." "What people?" "Your class, the class I belonged to until recently. Those who by inheritance or industry or brains or dishonesty have become the moneyed class." "Do you imagine that if that road mender over there had the money he'd be any more willing to give it up?" "No, but what's that got to do with it?" The older man considered. "No, I'll admit it hasn't. It rather sounds as if it had, though. In fact," continued Amory, "he'd be worse. The lower classes are narrower, less pleasant, and personally more selfish, certainly more stupid. But all that has nothing to do with the question." "Just exactly what is the question?" Here Amory had to pause to consider exactly what the question was. Amory coins a phrase. "When life gets hold of a brainy man of fair education," began Amory slowly, "that is, when he marries he becomes, 9 times out of 10, a conservative as far as existing social conditions are concerned. He may be unselfish, kind-hearted, even just in his own way, but his first job is to provide and to hold fast. His wife shoes him on, from 10,000 a year to 20,000 a year, on, in an enclosed treadmill that hasn't any windows. He's done. Life's got him. He's no help. He's a spiritually married man." Amory paused and decided that it wasn't such a bad phrase. "Some men," he continued, "escape the grip. Maybe their wives have no social ambitions, maybe they've hit a sentence or two in a dangerous book that pleased them, maybe they started on the treadmill as I did and were knocked off. Anyway, they're the congressmen you can't bribe, the presidents who aren't politicians, the writers, speakers, scientists, statesmen who aren't just popular grab bags for a half-dozen women and children." "He's the natural radical?" "Yes," said Amory. "He may vary from the disillusioned critic like old Thornton Hancock, all the way to Trotsky. Now the spiritually unmarried man hasn't direct power, for unfortunately the spiritually married man, as a byproduct of his money chase, has garnered in the great newspaper, the popular magazine, the influential weekly, so that Mrs. Newspaper, Mrs. Magazine, Mrs. Weekly can have a better limousine than those oil people across the street or those cement people round the corner." "Why not?" "It makes wealthy men the keepers of the world's intellectual conscience and, of course, a man who has money under one set of social institutions quite naturally can't risk his family's happiness by letting the clamor for another appear in his newspaper." "But it appears," said the big man. "Where? In the discredited mediums. Rotten cheap-papered weeklies." "All right, go on." "Well, my first point is that through a mixture of conditions of which the family is the first, there are these two sorts of brains. One sort takes human nature as it finds it, uses its timidity, its weakness, and its strength for its own ends. Opposed is the man who, being spiritually unmarried, continually seeks for new systems that will control or counteract human nature. His problem is harder. It is not life that's complicated, it's the struggle to guide and control life. That is his struggle. He is a part of progress, the spiritually married man is not." The big man produced 3 big cigars, and proffered them on his huge palm. The little man took one. Amory shook his head and reached for a cigarette. "Go on talking," said the big man. "I've been wanting to hear one of you fellows." Going faster. "Modern life," began Amory again, "changes no longer century by century, but year by year, 10 times faster than it ever has before, populations doubling, civilizations unified more closely with other civilizations, economic interdependence, racial questions, and we're dawdling along. My idea is that we've got to go very much faster. He slightly emphasized the last words and the chauffeur unconsciously increased the speed of the car. Amory and the big man laughed, the little man laughed, too, after a pause. Every child, said Amory, should have an equal start. If his father can endow him with a good physique and his mother with some common sense and his early education, that should be his heritage. If the father can't give him a good physique, if the mother has spent in chasing men the years in which she should have been preparing herself to educate her children, so much the worse for the child. He shouldn't be artificially bolstered up with money, sent to these horrible tutoring schools, dragged through college. Every boy ought to have an equal start. All right, said the big man, his goggles indicating neither approval nor objection. Next, I'd have a fair trial of government ownership of all industries. That's been proven a failure. No, it merely failed. If we had government ownership, we'd have the best analytical business minds in the government working for something besides themselves. We'd have McKays instead of Burlesons, we'd have Morgans in the Treasury Department, we'd have Hills running interstate commerce. We'd have the best lawyers in the Senate. They wouldn't give their best efforts for nothing. McAdoo. No, said Amory, shaking his head. Money isn't the only stimulus that brings out the best that's in a man, even in America. You said a while ago that it was. It is, right now. But if it were made illegal to have more than a certain amount, the best men would all flock for the one other reward which attracts humanity, honor. The big man made a sound that was very like boo.